When I bought my first house, I thought the neighborhood was exactly what I'd been looking for. I was 32 years old, recently divorced, and wanted somewhere quiet to start over. After months of apartment living, the idea of having my own driveway, a small backyard, and neighbors who actually knew each other sounded perfect. The house was located in a peaceful suburb just outside Columbus. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and families walking their dogs every evening made it feel like one of those neighborhoods where nothing bad ever happened. During my first few weeks there, everyone seemed friendly. The couple next door brought over homemade cookies, an older man across the street introduced himself while mowing his lawn, and children rode bicycles until sunset. It felt safe enough that I often left my curtains open at night without thinking twice about it. Across the street sat a two-story house that immediately stood out from the others. The grass was always trimmed, the porch was spotless, and the windows were clean, yet I never once saw anyone entering or leaving. The mailbox was emptied every morning, porch lights turned on every evening at exactly the same time, and trash bins appeared on the curb every Tuesday before sunrise. Someone clearly lived there, but whoever it was seemed to exist only when nobody else was watching. About a month after moving in, I finally saw him. Early one Saturday morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and noticed a man standing perfectly still in his front yard. He looked to be in his late 60s, dressed in neatly pressed slacks, a white button-up shirt, and a dark sweater, despite the warm weather. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his hands rested behind his back as he stared toward my house. Thinking he's simply admiring the neighborhood, I smiled and waved. He didn't wave back. He simply continued staring. After several uncomfortable seconds, he slowly turned around and walked back inside without saying a word. It was strange, but not enough to worry me. Over the following weeks, however, I began noticing him more often. Every morning around 6:30, he'd stand in the exact same spot facing my house. Every evening around sunset, he'd do it again. Never speaking, never moving, just watching. At first, I joked about it with coworkers, calling him the neighborhood statue. They laughed and told me every suburb had at least one odd neighbor. I agreed. Then, small things started happening. One evening, I came home from work to find my garbage bin sitting neatly beside my garage instead of at the curb where I'd left it. I assumed another neighbor had been helping. The following week, my package from an online order disappeared from the porch. I reported it stolen. The next morning, it was sitting on my kitchen table. Every door and window had been locked when I left for work. Nothing else in the house was missing. Only the package had somehow moved inside. I convinced myself I'd simply brought it in the night before and forgotten. Stress can make people remember things incorrectly. That's what I kept telling myself. A few nights later, I woke around 2 a.m. because I thought I heard footsteps outside. Pulling back the bedroom curtain, I looked toward the street. The old man was standing on the sidewalk, directly opposite my bedroom window. He wasn't looking at the house anymore. He was looking directly at me. Even from across the street, I could tell he wasn't blinking. I immediately called the non-emergency police number. By the time officers arrived 15 minutes later, the street was empty. They knocked on his door anyway. Nobody answered. One officer later told me the house appeared completely vacant. The utilities were active, but there was almost no furniture inside. Only a dining table, a single chair, and dozens of framed family photographs covering one wall. The officers suggested I install security cameras if I felt uncomfortable. The next weekend, I installed 4 cameras covering every angle of the property. For several nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 5th night, one of the cameras detected movement at 3:17 a.m. I opened the recording. The old man walked calmly across my front lawn. He never looked at the camera. He walked directly to my front porch, stopped, then slowly looked toward my bedroom window. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like someone recognizing an old friend. Then he quietly walked away. Police reviewed the footage. When they visited his house again, it was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no photographs, nothing. The utilities had been disconnected nearly 8 months earlier. That should have been the end of it. Instead, things became worse. Over the following month, every camera on my property captured strange moments that never made sense. Sometimes the old man appeared standing beside my mailbox, sometimes behind my backyard fence. Once, he stood outside my living room window for nearly 20 minutes without moving. Yet every time officers arrived, he was gone. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I met the woman who had lived in my house before me. She stopped by to collect a piece of mail that had accidentally been delivered to the old address. While chatting, I casually mentioned the elderly man across the street. The color drained from her face. "You've seen him too?" I nodded. She remained silent for several seconds before asking, "Does he still stand in the yard every morning?" A chill ran through me. She explained that she'd lived there for almost 6 years. The man had watched her house almost every day. She'd reported him countless times. Police never found enough evidence to charge him with anything. Eventually, she became so frightened that she sold the house and moved away. Before leaving, she handed me something folded inside an old envelope. It was left in my mailbox the week before I moved. Inside was a photograph. It showed my house taken from across the street. Standing in my front yard was me. The picture had been taken only 3 days earlier. I had never seen anyone with a camera. On the back, someone had written in careful handwriting, "The house always belongs to someone." That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I checked the security cameras. The front yard was empty. The backyard was empty. The driveway was empty. Then I opened the camera facing my living room. For a moment, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The camera wasn't showing the room. It was showing me, standing in front of the monitor, looking directly into the lens. Except I wasn't standing there. I was sitting upstairs in my bedroom. Before I could process it, the figure on the screen smiled. Then the recording ended. I grabbed a baseball bat and searched every room in the house. Nothing. Doors locked, windows locked, nobody inside. The next morning, I packed a suitcase and left. I never spent another night in that house. A few months later, curiosity led me to check online real estate listings. The house had been sold again. The newest listing photo showed a young couple smiling on the front porch. Across the street, standing in the exact same place as always, was the old man, watching, patiently waiting for the next family to move in. When my wife and I moved into our new home, we weren't looking for luxury. We just wanted a quiet place where we could raise our 2 young children away from the noise of the city. I was 38 at the time and worked remotely as an accountant, while my wife taught at a local elementary school. We found a modest house in a peaceful neighborhood outside Portland. The streets were lined with tall pine trees. Most of the homes had been there for decades, and nearly everyone seemed to know one another. During the first few weeks, neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. Children played basketball in the evenings, and families gathered for weekend barbecues. It felt like the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked without worrying about what might happen. The only house that seemed different belonged to the man living directly behind us. His backyard shared a long wooden fence with ours, but unlike everyone else, he never introduced himself. We rarely saw him during the day. Occasionally, I'd notice him mowing his lawn or carrying groceries inside, but he always kept his head down and avoided eye contact. The other neighbors didn't seem to dislike him, but whenever his name came up in conversation, people quickly changed the subject. I assumed he was simply a private person. A few months after moving in, I began working from the patio whenever the weather was nice. That's when I first started hearing strange noises coming from the other side of the fence. At first, it sounded like someone digging, slow, steady scraping, followed by the dull thud of dirt being moved. The sound usually started around midnight and continued for an hour or two before stopping completely. I mentioned it to my wife, but she had never heard anything. She suggested it might be an animal, or perhaps our neighbor gardening at unusual hours. The noises continued several nights a week. One Saturday morning, while trimming bushes near the fence, I noticed fresh dirt piled neatly against the other side. It stretched almost the entire length of the property line. Curious, I climbed onto a small ladder to peek over the fence. The backyard looked perfectly normal. Freshly cut grass, a small storage shed, a vegetable garden. No holes, no piles of dirt, nothing that could explain the sounds I'd been hearing. As I climbed down, a voice behind the fence calmly said, "You shouldn't look over." I nearly dropped the ladder. The neighbor was standing only a few feet away on the opposite side. His voice wasn't angry. If anything, it sounded almost polite. I apologized and explained that I'd been curious about the late-night digging. There was a long silence. Then he quietly replied, "I've never dug anything." That answer stayed with me. A week later, my youngest son came running inside after playing in the backyard. He said he'd found a small toy car buried near the fence. At first, I assumed it belonged to one of the previous owners, but when I looked more closely, the toy was extremely old. Its paint had faded almost completely, and the metal wheels were rusted solid. The strange part was that it had been buried only a few inches beneath the surface, as though someone had placed it there recently. Over the following days, we found more objects: a child's shoe, an old wristwatch, a cracked porcelain doll. Everything had been buried in a straight line running alongside the fence. I eventually decided to call the city, assuming construction debris had somehow been left underground years earlier. Before anyone could inspect the yard, something happened that made the buried objects seem insignificant. One evening, while taking the trash outside, I noticed movement behind the fence. Someone was standing on the other side. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there. I couldn't see the person's face, only the top of their head above the wooden boards. Thinking it was my neighbor, I called out. No response. The figure remained completely still. After several uncomfortable seconds, it slowly lowered out of sight. The following morning, I asked my neighbor whether he'd been in his yard the night before. He looked genuinely confused. "I've been out of town since Tuesday." He even showed me the luggage in his truck after returning home only an hour earlier. I didn't know what to say. That night, I installed motion-activated lights along the fence. Around 2:40 a.m., every light switched on simultaneously. I immediately checked the backyard through the kitchen window. Nothing. No movement, no person. Then, I noticed the lights weren't illuminating our side of the fence. They were illuminating someone walking slowly on the other side. Only their shadow was visible. The figure moved steadily from one end of the fence to the other. When it reached the far corner, it stopped. Then, the shadow simply disappeared. The next morning, I inspected the fence. Near the bottom of one board was a tiny hole, barely large enough to look through. Curious, I crouched down. Instead of seeing the neighbor's yard, I saw another fence, only a few feet away. Confused, I stood up and looked over the top. The yard appeared completely normal. When I looked through the hole again, the second fence was still there, as though the space behind ours had somehow become much deeper than it should have been. I covered the hole with a piece of wood and tried to forget about it. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of knocking. Not at the front door. From the fence. 3 slow knocks, then silence. A minute later, 3 more. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the backyard. Rain had begun falling lightly. The yard was empty. As I turned to go back inside, another 3 knocks echoed from the fence, this time directly in front of me. I shined the flashlight across the boards. Nothing. Then a quiet voice came from the other side. "Don't answer." The voice sounded exactly like my neighbor. The problem was, at that exact moment, I saw his car pulling into his driveway from the street. He had only just arrived home. The knocking stopped immediately. The next morning, I finally told my neighbor everything. To my surprise, he didn't laugh. He simply stared at the fence for a long moment. Then he said, "The previous owner used to hear it too." Before I could ask another question, he walked into his shed and returned carrying an old photograph. It showed both of our houses shortly after they had been built decades earlier. There was no fence between them. Instead, a narrow dirt path separated the properties. Standing on that path were several children. One of them held the same rusted toy car my son had found buried in our yard. On the back of the photograph, someone had written only one sentence: "They still walk between the yards." A month later, both my neighbor and I agreed to replace the aging wooden fence with a taller vinyl one. The workers removed every board without finding anything unusual. By sunset, the new fence was finished. The knocking never returned. Neither did the shadows. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is completely still, I'll glance toward the fence and notice a line of muddy footprints leading along the grass. They always stop halfway across the yard, as if whoever made them remembered there was once a path there and forgot it had been closed. I never considered myself the kind of person who paid attention to other people's lives. I was 34 years old, worked from home as a software developer, and spent most of my days staring at computer screens. My wife often joked that I noticed software bugs more quickly than I noticed people. We had recently moved into a quiet neighborhood outside Nashville after our first daughter was born. The slower pace of life was exactly what we wanted. The houses were spaced comfortably apart. Everyone kept their lawns tidy, and evenings were so peaceful that the loudest sounds usually came from crickets or sprinklers. It felt like the perfect place to raise a family. Our next-door neighbors moved in about 2 months after we did. A middle-aged couple, very polite, very quiet. They introduced themselves on moving day, exchanged phone numbers in case of emergencies, and thanked everyone for making them feel welcome. Nothing about them seemed unusual. They smiled when they passed us outside, collected their mail every afternoon, and kept their property in immaculate condition. The only strange thing was their lights. Every night, without fail, the lights inside their house switched on and off in the exact same order. At precisely 7 p.m., the kitchen light turned on. At 7:05, the dining room. At 7:12, the upstairs hallway. At 7:18, the master bedroom. By 10 p.m., every light switched off one by one in the exact reverse order. It happened every single night, weekdays, weekends, holidays, even during severe thunderstorms. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I realized the timing never changed, not by a single minute. One evening, I mentioned it to my wife while we were watching television. She looked out the window. "That's actually kind of creepy." After that, we both started noticing it. A few weeks later, I happened to glance outside at 7 p.m. The kitchen light turned on exactly as expected, but something else caught my attention. No one had entered the room. The light simply switched on. 5 minutes later, the dining room lit up. Still no movement, no silhouettes, no sounds. Just empty rooms becoming illuminated. Curiosity got the better of me. The next afternoon, while mowing the lawn, I struck up a conversation with the husband. Trying to sound casual, I joked that they had the most punctual lighting schedule I'd ever seen. He smiled. We like routines. That was all he said. I laughed politely and thought nothing more of it. Until the following Friday. That evening, around 8:30 p.m., our neighborhood lost power. The entire street went dark. Every house, every streetlight, everything. Except theirs. Every light inside their home remained on exactly according to schedule. Bright, steady, as though nothing had happened. I walked outside with several neighbors. Everyone noticed it. One neighbor even joked that they must have bought the world's best backup generator. But there was no sound, no generator humming, no portable equipment outside. Nothing. 20 minutes later, the power returned. The lights in their house continued following the exact same sequence without interruption. The next morning, I asked the electric company whether certain homes had private backup systems. The representative checked the address. No registered generator. That answer didn't help. Over the following month, stranger things started happening. Sometimes I'd wake around 3 a.m. and notice a light glowing in the upstairs bedroom. It wasn't part of the normal schedule. It would remain on for only a minute, then disappear. Whenever I looked closely, someone appeared to be standing in the window, completely still, watching the street. The following morning, I'd see the neighbors leaving for work as though nothing had happened. One rainy Saturday, I finally had an excuse to enter their house. A package had been delivered to my porch by mistake, so I carried it next door. The wife answered almost immediately. She thanked me warmly and invited me inside while she searched for a package meant for my address. The interior surprised me. The house was almost empty. Not abandoned, just sparse. Minimal furniture, bare walls, no family photographs, no decorations, nothing that made it feel lived in. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Every room contained digital timers mounted beside the switches. Each displayed countdown clocks synchronized to the exact second. As I stared at one, it reached 0. Click. The hallway light switched on. The wife smiled when she noticed me looking. My husband loves automation. I nodded. That explanation made sense, at least for a moment. Then I realized something. The timer hadn't activated the hallway light. It had activated the bedroom light upstairs, a room that wasn't connected to that switch. I left shortly afterward, feeling strangely unsettled. 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of my daughter crying. As I walked past the bedroom window to check on her, I noticed every light inside the neighbor's house was on. Every single one. The time was 2:47 a.m. That had never happened before. Then, every light went out simultaneously. The entire house became pitch black. A few seconds later, every window filled with silhouettes, dozens of them, standing perfectly still, looking outward. I counted at least 15 figures. There should have been only 2 people living there. I blinked. The silhouettes vanished. the lights returned to normal. The next morning, police cars surrounded the house. Not because of my report, because neither neighbor had been seen for over a week. Coworkers had requested a welfare check after they stopped answering calls. Officers forced open the front door. The house was empty. Completely empty. No clothing, no food, no toiletries, nothing. The timers remained mounted on every wall, still counting, still switching lights on and off. Investigators eventually concluded the couple had left unexpectedly. No forwarding address, no financial activity, no explanation. Months passed. Another family purchased the house. They renovated it completely, removed every timer, repainted every room. Life slowly returned to normal. Then one evening, nearly a year later, I happened to glance outside at exactly 7 p.m. The kitchen light turned on. At 7:05, the dining room. At 7:12, the upstairs hallway. The new owners were away on vacation. I knew that because we'd been feeding their cat. No one was inside the house, yet every light followed the exact same schedule. I called the homeowner immediately. He checked his security cameras from his phone. The cameras showed empty rooms, no people, just lights turning on one after another. Then he suddenly went quiet. "What?" I asked. He whispered, "There's someone standing behind the camera." The video disconnected before I could respond. The homeowners returned the next morning. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been disturbed, but every digital clock in the house displayed exactly the same time, 7 p.m. They moved out less than 2 months later. The house has had 3 different owners since then. Every family eventually leaves. The lights never do. I moved into the neighborhood after accepting a promotion that required me to relocate across the state. I was 36 years old, recently engaged, and excited to finally afford a house instead of another apartment. The neighborhood outside Charlotte seemed perfect. It was quiet, clean, and filled with families who had lived there for years. On moving day, several neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, offering restaurant recommendations, and even helping me carry a few boxes into the garage. It immediately felt welcoming. The only person I didn't meet that day was the man living directly next door. I finally saw him 2 days later. I was watering the front lawn when he casually walked over and introduced himself as Daniel. He looked to be in his early 50s, dressed neatly, and spoke with the confidence of someone who enjoyed conversation. He welcomed me to the neighborhood, shook my hand, and somehow managed to make me feel comfortable within minutes. Before walking away, he smiled and said, "I hope your fiancé likes the blue bedroom upstairs." I laughed. "How did you know it was blue?" He paused, then shrugged. "Just a lucky guess." At first, I thought nothing of it. The bedroom really was blue because the previous owners had painted it that color. Maybe he'd known them. Over the next few weeks, however, Daniel kept making strange comments. Whenever I left for work, he'd wave from his porch and say things like, "Running late today?" Even on mornings when I'd overslept. He somehow knew when I'd ordered takeout before the delivery driver even arrived. One afternoon, he smiled and asked, "How's your mother's knee doing?" My mother lived nearly 800 miles away. She had recently undergone surgery. I had never mentioned it to anyone in the neighborhood. I stared at him. "Have we talked about my family before?" He looked genuinely surprised. "I assumed you told me." No. He apologized and changed the subject. That should have been enough for me to ignore it. Instead, the comments became even more personal. He congratulated me on receiving a work bonus before my company officially announced it. He asked whether my fiancée had decided on the wedding venue 2 days before we'd made the final decision. He even joked about a childhood scar on my shoulder. A scar hidden beneath my shirt. Eventually, I convinced myself someone had been sharing information. Maybe another neighbor. Maybe social media. People reveal more online than they realize. So I deleted every public profile I had. Nothing changed. If anything, Daniel seemed even more informed. One evening, my fiancée and I were assembling furniture in the living room when she casually asked, "Did you tell your neighbor we're thinking about getting a dog?" I looked up. No. He asked me whether we'd chosen a Labrador or a Golden Retriever. We hadn't told anyone. In fact, we'd only discussed it privately that morning over breakfast. Neither of us could explain it. That's when I started checking the house. I searched every room for hidden cameras or microphones. Nothing. I changed the Wi-Fi password, replaced the smart doorbell, reset every electronic device. Still, nothing. One Saturday afternoon, I finally confronted Daniel. I tried to stay polite. I simply asked how he always seemed to know so much about us. He smiled, then gave the strangest answer I'd ever heard. "I don't know things, I remember them." I laughed awkwardly. "What does that even mean?" His smile faded. "You'll understand eventually." Then he walked back inside without another word. For the first time since moving there, I genuinely felt uneasy. A few nights later, I woke around 3 a.m. after hearing footsteps outside. Looking through the bedroom window, I saw Daniel standing in his driveway. He wasn't looking at my house. He was looking at the sky, completely motionless. Then, very slowly, he turned toward my bedroom window. Even from that distance, I could tell he was smiling. The next morning, I noticed fresh footprints leading across my front yard. They stopped directly beneath our bedroom window. There were no footprints leading away, only toward it. I reported everything to the police. An officer interviewed Daniel later that afternoon. He cooperated fully, friendly, calm, no criminal record, no suspicious behavior. There was nothing they could do. Life continued, but I became obsessed. Every conversation with Daniel felt rehearsed. Every smile felt calculated. Then, something happened that I still can't explain. One evening, my fiancé and I decided, completely on impulse, to postpone our wedding by 6 months because of work commitments. We hadn't told anyone, not family, not friends, no emails, no messages, nothing. The next morning, Daniel waved as I checked the mailbox. Probably for the best. What? June weather is much nicer than December. I froze. That was exactly the new date we'd chosen. I didn't respond. I simply walked back inside. That afternoon, I installed security cameras covering every side of the property. 3 nights later, one camera alerted me to movement at exactly 2:18 a.m. I opened the footage expecting to see Daniel. Instead, the recording showed me, standing in Daniel's backyard, looking toward my own house. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The timestamp confirmed it was happening live at that exact moment. I was sitting in my living room watching the recording. The figure slowly turned toward the camera. It had my face, my height, my clothes. It smiled, then walked into Daniel's house. I ran outside immediately. Police arrived within minutes. Daniel answered the door wearing pajamas, looking half asleep. His house was spotless. No one else was inside. The officers searched every room. Nothing. I reviewed the security footage again the following morning. The recording had changed. Now it showed an empty backyard. No movement. No figure. Almost as though the previous video had never existed. Months later, Daniel unexpectedly moved away. No goodbye, no moving truck. One day his house was occupied. The next day it was empty. A young couple purchased it shortly afterward. While introducing myself, I casually asked whether the previous owner had left anything behind. The husband laughed. Just one weird thing. He disappeared inside and returned carrying a small notebook. It's full of information about everyone in the neighborhood. Curious, I opened it. Each page listed a different address, names, birthdays, jobs, family members, daily routines. The final page belonged to my house. Everything written about me was accurate, except for the last entry. It read, "Will leave next October." I closed the notebook immediately. That was 5 years ago. I never moved. At least, not yet. But every October, I catch myself looking at moving companies online, almost without realizing why. Sometimes I wonder whether Daniel ever predicted the future, or whether he simply knew something that the rest of us hadn't reached yet. When my wife and I bought our house, one of the biggest selling points was the attached garage. It sounds like a small thing, but after years of living in apartments and scraping ice off my car every winter, being able to pull straight into my own garage felt like a luxury. I was 40 years old at the time and worked as an insurance investigator in Minneapolis. My job often involved long hours, so I usually came home well after dark. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with retired couples and young families, and everyone seemed to look out for each other. It wasn't the kind of place where you expected anything unusual to happen. The house next door belonged to an elderly widower named Frank. He'd lived there for more than 30 years and quickly became one of the friendliest people on the street. Every morning he'd wave while collecting his newspaper, and every Saturday he spent hours working in his garage. Sometimes he'd restore old furniture, sometimes he'd repair bicycles for neighborhood kids, but his garage door was almost always open. He told me he hated feeling closed off to the neighborhood. Then one Monday morning, the garage door stayed shut. I didn't think much of it. People traveled, people got sick. It wasn't unusual. The next day, it was still closed. So was the day after that. By the end of the week, I realized something felt wrong. Frank's car was still parked in the driveway. His mailbox was overflowing. His porch light remained on 24 hours a day. I knocked on his front door several times. No answer. I called the number he'd once given me in case of emergencies. Straight to voicemail. Eventually, I contacted the police for a welfare check. 2 officers arrived that afternoon. They searched the house. A few minutes later, one of them walked back outside. Nobody's home. They explained that although the car was present, there were signs Frank had left voluntarily. His wallet, medication, and clothing were gone. It didn't make sense. Frank never went anywhere without telling at least one neighbor. Still, there was no evidence of foul play. Life moved on. A week later, a moving company emptied the house. According to another neighbor, Frank had apparently sold it to a young couple. Within days, they moved in. Mark and Emily. Friendly. Normal. Exactly the kind of people you'd expect to live there. But something strange happened almost immediately. Their garage door never opened. Not once, despite owning 2 vehicles. Every morning, they left through the front door. Every evening, they parked in the driveway. The garage remained permanently closed. One Saturday, I joked with Mark while we were both mowing our lawns. "You know you've got a perfectly good garage, right?" He smiled awkwardly. "We're using it for storage." That seemed reasonable, until I realized I never heard a single sound coming from inside. No footsteps, no tools, no boxes being moved, nothing. About a month later, I came home from work just after midnight. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something unusual. The neighbor's garage door was open, only about 2 feet, just enough to reveal darkness inside. I couldn't see much, only the concrete floor. Then, a pair of shoes. Someone was standing just inside the opening, perfectly still. The garage door slowly closed. The shoes disappeared. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mark. He frowned. Our garage door hasn't opened in weeks. I didn't argue. Maybe I'd imagined it. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I parked across the street and watched. The garage door rose exactly 2 feet, stopped, no further. The same pair of shoes appeared beneath the gap, black work boots, completely motionless. After nearly a minute, the door quietly lowered again. The following weekend, I installed a security camera above my own garage. Not because I suspected my neighbors, I simply wanted to know whether I was imagining things. 3 nights later, the camera detected motion at 2:13 a.m. I opened the footage. The garage door across the street slowly lifted. The boots appeared exactly as before. Then something else happened. The person stepped forward. Only 1 foot emerged beneath the door, then another. The garage door never opened any higher. It should have been impossible. There wasn't enough space for an adult to crawl underneath. Yet the figures somehow walked normally, as though the opening were full height. The person crossed the driveway and disappeared behind the house. I replayed the footage several times. The same impossible movement occurred every time. The next morning, the recording had changed. Now it simply showed the garage door remaining closed all night. No movement, no figure, nothing. I began questioning my own memory until another neighbor knocked on my door. He asked if he'd seen anyone outside around 2 in the morning. When I hesitated, he quietly admitted he'd witnessed someone walking out of the closed garage several nights earlier. He'd told his wife. She didn't believe him. Neither of us knew what to make of it. A few weeks later, Mark and Emily invited several neighbors over for a barbecue. It was the first time anyone had been inside their backyard. The garage was attached directly to the patio. Its side door stood open. Curiosity got the better of me. While everyone else chatted outside, I glanced through the doorway. The garage was empty. Not mostly empty, completely empty. Bare concrete walls, no shelves, no tools, no boxes, not even a light fixture. Yet from outside, the garage looked perfectly normal, large enough to store 2 cars. The inside was barely the size of a walk-in closet. I quickly stepped away before anyone noticed. That evening, I searched old property records online. The original blueprints showed something interesting. The garage hadn't always been attached to the house. Years earlier, it had been a separate workshop belonging to the previous owner. The records ended abruptly after a fire destroyed the building. It had supposedly been demolished before the current garage was constructed. The dates didn't match. According to satellite photos, the original workshop had never actually disappeared. Months passed. I stopped paying attention. Life returned to normal. Then, a rainy evening, while taking out the trash, I heard the familiar sound of the garage door opening, slowly, mechanically. I looked up. It had risen exactly 2 feet. Standing beneath it was Frank. He looked exactly as I remembered. Same flannel shirt, same gray beard,
Same gentle smile. He looked directly at me, raised one finger to his lips, then stepped backward into the darkness. The garage door closed. The next morning, I walked across the street and knocked. Mark answered. I casually asked if everything was all right. He smiled. Never better. As we talked, I glanced toward the garage. The side door stood slightly open. Inside, for just a second, I saw dozens of pairs of shoes lined neatly across the floor, all facing outward, waiting. I never told anyone what I saw. Sometimes, when I come home late from work, I still slow down as I pass their driveway. The garage door has never opened completely, only 2 feet, just enough for someone or something to leave.
The house next to mine sat empty for almost 4 years. When I first moved into the neighborhood, everyone told me the same thing. Don't expect anyone to buy that place. Nobody ever explained why. They'd simply shrug, change the subject, or say the owners always left after a few months. I assumed the house had serious structural problems or maybe a history that made buyers nervous. I didn't think much about it. I was 33 years old, worked as a freelance photographer, and had chosen the quiet suburb outside Denver because it gave me plenty of peace between assignments. Most days I edited photos for my home office, and most evenings I walked my dog through the neighborhood. Life was simple, predictable, and exactly what I wanted. The empty house slowly became part of the scenery. The grass was somehow always cut. The bushes were trimmed. Packages never accumulated, yet nobody ever entered or left. Every few weeks, a real estate sign appeared in the front yard. Within days, it disappeared again. No sold sticker, no moving truck, nothing. One afternoon while walking my dog, I noticed something different. The curtains upstairs had changed. They'd always been white. Now they were dark blue. I figured someone had finally bought the place. The following morning, I saw a woman standing on the front porch. She looked to be in her early 40s, wearing a gray cardigan and holding a coffee mug. When she noticed me looking, she smiled and waved. I waved back. It felt good knowing the house was finally occupied. Later that evening, I introduced myself. She said her name was Claire. Friendly, soft-spoken, perfectly ordinary. She mentioned her husband worked nights and their teenage son would be moving in after finishing the school year. Nothing about the conversation stood out. Over the next couple of weeks, we'd occasionally chat while collecting the mail or watering our lawns. She always seemed pleasant. The strange part was, I never saw anyone else. Not her husband, not her son, not even visitors. Only Claire. One Saturday morning, I offered to help carry a heavy box from her driveway. She smiled apologetically. I've already got it. The odd thing was, the box lifted itself. Not dramatically. It simply slid across the porch toward the front door. Claire didn't react. She acted as though she'd picked it up herself. I stood there, completely confused. Maybe I'd misjudged the angle. Maybe I hadn't seen it clearly. That's what I told myself. Then little things started happening. At exactly 8 p.m. every evening, every light inside her house switched on simultaneously. Not one room after another, every room at once. Exactly 1 hour later, every light turned off. Again, all together, no exceptions, no variation. One rainy afternoon, Claire knocked on my door asking to borrow a flashlight because, according to her, the electricity kept cutting out. That surprised me. None of the other houses had lost power. I lent her one anyway. The next day, she returned it, still sealed in its original packaging. The batteries had never been installed. When I jokingly asked whether she'd fixed the outage, She looked puzzled. What outage? I reminded her she'd borrowed the flashlight. She smiled politely. I don't think I did. I assumed she'd simply forgotten. A few nights later, my dog refused to go near the fence separating our properties. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He simply froze. His ears flattened against his head, and he stared toward Claire's house without moving. Then, he quietly backed away and pulled me toward the back door. He never behaved like that before, or after. About a month later, I woke around 2:30 a.m. because my security camera detected motion. Expecting to see a raccoon or stray cat, I checked the live feed. Claire was standing in my backyard. She faced my house, completely still, barefoot, wearing the same gray cardigan. I hurried downstairs and looked through the kitchen window. The backyard was empty. I checked the camera again. She was still there, standing exactly where I'd looked, watching my house. Then, she slowly smiled. The live feed froze for 5 seconds. When it reconnected 5 seconds later, she was gone. The next morning, I walked over and asked whether she'd been outside during the night. She laughed. I sleep like a rock. There wasn't the slightest hint she was lying. Days turned into weeks. The strange incidents continued. Sometimes I'd glance out my office window and see Claire gardening. Then I'd blink, and she'd already be standing on her front porch, as though she'd crossed the yard instantly. Other times I'd hear her voice outside, chatting with someone. When I looked, she was alone. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I searched county property records. According to the documents, the house had never been sold. It still belonged to the same elderly couple who'd owned it for decades. I called the listed phone number. An older man answered. When I mentioned the address, he went silent, then quietly said, "We moved out 3 years ago." I explained that another family was living there now. He immediately replied, "No one has." The call ended shortly afterward. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next evening, I knocked on Claire's front door. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. The door slowly swung open. Inside, the house was empty. No furniture, no boxes, no curtains, nothing. Dust covered every floor. The rooms looked abandoned for years, yet through the upstairs window, I saw Claire smiling down at me. I rushed outside. The upstairs room was empty. Every room was empty. Police searched the property the following day. There was no sign anyone had lived there recently. No fingerprints, no food, no clothing. Nothing. They assumed I'd mistaken another house. I knew I hadn't. A few months later, the property finally sold. A young family moved in. They renovated everything. Fresh paint, new roof, new landscaping. One afternoon, while introducing myself, the new owner casually mentioned something strange. "We keep finding coffee mugs." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're empty." He laughed nervously. "We throw them away." The next morning, they're back on the porch. He thought someone was playing a prank. I didn't tell him about Claire. There wasn't any point. Last winter, during the first snowfall, I happened to look out my bedroom window before sunrise. Fresh snow covered every yard, completely untouched. Except next door.
There was a single set of footprints leading from the front porch across the lawn, stopping directly beneath my bedroom window. There were no footprints leading away. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night feeling as though someone is standing outside. I never open the curtains anymore, because if Claire is still there, I'd rather not know whether she's smiling.